Imagine someone saying to you, we've been dealing with the same car dealer for over 30 years, and he has given us good deals pretty consistently, but even if he doesn't give us the best deal, we're going to stick with him no matter what. What would prompt someone to do that, to say that? What do you think? Apparently you've never done that. Loyalty. You knew the family. Past experience. You trust him. I might get a better deal someplace else, but sticking with this guy. A very big issue in this instance, as it is with the rest of our lives, is the fact of perspective. What makes a good deal? Maybe I'll get it cheaper and the very same thing I'm looking for elsewhere, but somebody's got to repair this car. And I've been dealing with this person for a long time. My perspective on this thing is a little different from the person who says, whatever I can do to save a buck, that's where I'm going to go. A difference in perspective will make a difference in the choice that you make, the decision that you make. In Daniel chapter 1, the first 2 verses of this book give us a difference in perspective that shows up throughout the whole book. In the first verse, Daniel 1:1, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. That's what we can see. Enemy king coming with his army, laying siege to the city of Jerusalem. That's what we see. The next verse gives a different perspective. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. This isn't just a horrible invading army. This is God's hand at work. Do you see the difference in perspective? One just sees what you can see with your eyes. The other understands there are things going on here that we can't see, and they're just as real. And so in Daniel chapter 2, when Nebuchadnezzar had that bizarre and frightening dream about the statue made of so many different materials, Daniel, servant of God, was the only one of Nebuchadnezzar's advisors who could not only relay the dream, but interpret it for him correctly. And the perspective that Daniel brought was, Nebuchadnezzar, you are the head of gold on this amazing statue, but there will be other kingdoms after yours. Yours will not last forever. And God himself is creating a kingdom that will put an end to every other kingdom, and that kingdom will last forever. Nebuchadnezzar had his own perspective on the dream. And that's what brings us to chapter 3. And as I mentioned last week, and remind you of this, we know what happens in each of the episodes in this book. We know how the thing turns out. The guys in the middle of it did not know how it was going to turn out. Keep that in mind. Even though in chapter 2, after the dream and the interpretation, Nebuchadnezzar acknowledged that Daniel's God was a great God, a revealer of mysteries. But he was still stuck on himself and wasn't ready to say, that God is my God. I'm still in charge. And that statue that he built, perhaps it was built as his effort to show the world that the gold head in the statue in his dream is not just the head that will eventually end. He built this gigantic gold statue to kind of prove to everyone, my empire will last. Maybe He built this statue as a loyalty test. As the United States is divided into states, the empire of Babylon was divided into provinces, each one with its own, sometimes, language and customs and leadership. All of them beholden to Nebuchadnezzar. How do you keep control of so many different languages and customs and leaders? You scare them. Nebuchadnezzar had conquered much of the world at that time, and so he he commanded all the leaders from all these different provinces to come to the dedication of his statue. And when they got there, they were required to bow, perhaps as a test of their loyalty. Everything is going smoothly. The music is playing. The people are bowing. This is taking on the appearance of a worship service with Nebuchadnezzar's statue as the god. Until some rather jealous Babylonian officials came to the king and said, "We hate to burst your bubble, but these 3 guys that you appointed to be in charge of the province of Babylon, where the capital city is, these guys that you trusted, these guys that you thought were really loyal to you, they're not bowing. They're Hebrews, and they don't bow. You better do something about this." And you saw the tantrum that I took. My tantrums don't have the same kind of effect that Nebuchadnezzar's did. This man really had a security problem, and it came out in hostility. And he was so furious, he commanded these 3 men to come before him. Now, he liked these guys. They were efficient, they were effective, they were very, very good at what they did in their administrative position. But nobody defies Nebuchadnezzar. Because he liked them, he thought, maybe they don't get it. They're used to one God. This is just a loyalty test. I'll give them one more chance. Now, when you hear the music, let me make sure you understand. You bow down, all is well. If you don't, it's the furnace for you. And then he makes that statement that reveals his perspective. What God can rescue you from my hand then? I'm in charge. Don't you get that? I wish I could have seen the expressions on these 3 guys' faces. Their Babylonian names, of course. Can you say them with me? Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. I learned a long time a little bedtime thing to do with munchkins to remember the names. You kind of swing the little ones like this and get them ready to hop into the bed. Shadrach, Meshach, to bed we go. Plop. Those names that we know them by so much are their Babylonian names. They were assigned names, but they didn't reflect who they were. Mishael, Hananiah. Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah. They're Hebrew names that showed who they really are. And that identity gave them the capacity to stand in front of this bad-tempered, powerful emperor and say to him, and what they are about to say is one of the most powerful testimonies in all of Scripture of the reality of God in the lives of people who know and love Him. What God is able to rescue you from my hand? And then they said these immortal words. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to save us from it, and He will rescue us from your hand, O King. But even if He does not, we want you to know, O King, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. Nebuchadnezzar, you believe you've given us an offer we can't refuse. We're here to tell you the Lord has made a better deal with us, and we're sticking with him. In that moment, with everything stacked against them and no possible escape unless the Lord intervenes, at that moment, when they were standing before him and took that stand, that's the moment that God's kingdom broke through. In Daniel 2:44, that statue that Nebuchadnezzar had dreamed of, and the stone that was cut out and came and smashed the statue, showing that God's kingdom would come and eliminate every other rival kingdom and last forever. His kingdom had its breakthrough moment, not in the furnace, but when they were standing in front of Nebuchadnezzar. When they took that stand, the kingdom showed up. Let me explain something about the kingdom, and you've heard this before. The line in the Lord's Prayer, "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven." There is an aspect of the kingdom that is not yet. When Jesus returns, and the Bible says, every knee will bow and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord to the glory of God the Father, that's when we will see the kingdom in all its glorious reality. But there is also a here and now aspect to the kingdom that becomes visible when God's people, in loving obedience, do what he wants, no matter what it costs them. These three men took that stand, and in that moment, Nebuchadnezzar saw the beginning of the end of his kingdom, though he didn't realize it at the time. Their stand made God's kingdom visible. In the late 1800s, in London, a surgeon named Joseph Lister was experimenting with the thought that you should wash your hands before surgery. You should sterilize your instruments before surgery. As he began introducing this idea, he was mocked, he was jeered. Surgeons would finish dealing with one person, with their bloodied hands, go to the next person and perform that surgery. And for some reason, infection was a major problem. How do we deal with that? They couldn't imagine until Joseph Lister began his campaign. During much of his life, he was ridiculed, but he stuck to it. He was convinced that the simple act of eliminating the blood that's already on your hands and cleaning your instruments with something called carbonic acid would make a difference in the outcome for the next patient. He was making visible something that people couldn't see. And it made all the difference for the people who survived. Sometimes the kingdom is more obvious, like it was with the three men. They got tossed in the fire. They came out safely because Jesus himself, what we believe, was a pre-incarnate manifestation of Jesus. Jesus showed up in that fire, protected them, and kept them. And everyone around, all the leaders from the various places around the world could come and see, this is how God cares for his own. You imagine them going home and telling that story? Sometimes the kingdom is obvious. Sometimes not so much. Sometimes the presence of the kingdom is harder to see, harder to detect. When the Roman Emperor Nero was having his field day with Christians, he would round up Christians, dip them in pitch, hang them from a pole in his garden, and then at night ignite them to light his garden parties. Where was Jesus to protect them? He was there. But his purpose for them wasn't to save them from the flame, it was to strengthen them, so that the reality of the kingdom could be seen by people who said, if they're even willing to die for this Jesus, maybe there's something to this. In his book, Against the Flow, Oxford professor John Lennox notes that when God calls us to do something difficult, he gives us the strength when we need it and not before then. He had an encounter with a Russian follower of Jesus who spent years in a Siberian labor camp for the crime of teaching his children about the Bible. Lennox writes this: he described to me that he had seen things that no man should ever have to see. I listened, thinking how little I really knew about life and wondering how I would have fared under those circumstances. As if he had read my thoughts, he suddenly said, "You couldn't cope with that, could you?" Embarrassed, I stumbled out something like, "No, I'm sure you're right." He then grinned and he said, "Neither could I. I was a man who fainted at the sight of my own blood, let alone that of others. But what I discovered in the camp was this: God does not help us to face theoretical situations, but real ones. In the same way, you couldn't imagine how one could cope in the gulag. I couldn't imagine it either, but once I was there, I found that God met me exactly as Jesus promised his disciples when he was preparing them for victimization and persecution." Lennox then adds, "We can be confident then that the Lord will give us sufficient amount of grace to handle whatever comes our way, whenever it comes our way, and not a moment before." "But Lord, what if the paycheck runs out before my bills are paid? But what if I will have to have this surgery?" He provides grace when it's needed. Please give a listen to this video as we prepare to close.
Sail the sea of faith, find out before too long how quickly blue skies can grow dark and gentle winds grow strong. And suddenly fever's like a white water pounding on your soul, but still we sail on knowing that our Lord is in control. Sometimes he calms the storm with a whisper, peace be still. He can settle any sea, but it doesn't mean he will. Sometimes he holds us close, lets the wind and waves go wild. Sometimes he calms the storm, and other times he calms his child. He has a reason for each trial that we pass through in life. Though we're shaken, we cannot be pulled apart from Christ. No matter how the driving rain beats down on those who hold to faith, a heart of trust will always be a quiet, peaceful place. Sometimes he calms the storm with a whisper, be still. He can settle any sea, but it doesn't mean he will. Sometimes he holds us close, lets the wind and waves go times he calls his child. Sometimes he calms the storm with a whisper, peace be still. He can settle any sea, but it doesn't mean he will. Sometimes he holds us close, lets the wind and waves go wild. Sometimes he calms the storm. Sometimes he calms the storm. Sometimes he calms the storm. And other times he calms his child.